I'd like to welcome everyone back to the virtual conference, Narrating the Holdemor, the Social and Cultural History of Collectivization and Famine in Soviet Ukraine. And this conference is being organized and sponsored by the Holdemor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And I'd like to thank the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies for their support in organizing the conference. The panel title is Repression, Resistance, and the Transformation of the Countryside During Collectivization and the Holdemor. We have two presenters and followed by a discussant. Since we have only two presenters, the presenters will be given up to 25 minutes rather than the normal 20. And the discussant can take up to 15 rather than the normal 10. And afterwards, we will have the question and answer period. And the questions can be posted on the chat by using the chat function on the program. And my name is Bogdan Klid. I'm with the Holdemor Research and Education Consortium, and I'm an historian. I'd like to, I guess, begin with the first panelist and the first or the first presentation, which will be a dual presentation. We have presenting for the first paper will be presented by Benjamin Dunbar and Raymond Taurus from Tulane University. And the title of their presentation is Mode of Production as a Contributing Factor to the Holdemor, a Tentative Analysis. I'd like to, before giving them the floor, I'd like to introduce them briefly. And first of all, Benjamin Dunbar graduated from Temple University with honors, double majoring in political science and Slavic studies. Having worked with Rosalind Hughes during his undergrad, he has conducted extensive research on the telecommunications industry in Russia, India, and China. After college, Benjamin spent time in Russia on a critical language scholarship from the US Department of State. And most recently, he has spent 2 years serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine. Today, Benjamin is a junior scholar working towards his doctorate at Tulane University. His research focuses on authoritarianism throughout the Soviet Union. Raymond Taurus, born and educated in Montreal. He studied at a number of European universities and began publishing scholarly books in the 1980s. He has authored or edited over 20 books, principally about Russian politics and European migration issues. He served on the faculty of universities including Harvard, Stanford, Michigan, European University Institute, Malmo, Warsaw, and Sussex. For 2 years, he was principal investigator on the National Research Council's twinning program with Ukraine, focusing on ethnic-related survey research. Most recently, Ray was Fulbright Distinguished Chair at the Australian National University in Canberra. He teaches at Tulane University at New Orleans. And I can now turn over the floor to the two presenters. 20 to 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Bogdan, for your introduction. And I'm so very pleased that both of us can be here and take part in this very, very important conference that's been very, very systematically organized for us. We both wish we could be in Edmonton, to be perfectly blunt. I have been a member of the Canadian Association of Slavists since around 1970, and I was at the first ICSE's meeting in 1974 in Banff. And one of my very first publications was in a book edited by Peter Potichny about ideology in the early 1970s. So I think I've got a long history of being a member and taking part sometimes in Canadian Association of Slavists when, and before COVID, when we had meetings with the Federation, but also through various types of other kind of ways of reaching you, and that is primarily remote. So let me get to the argument that Ben and I are making, and that is, how about starting off with Stalin? I know tradition in the USSR was your first quote was to Lenin, but here the first quote is to Stalin. The peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. That explains the fact that the peasantry constitutes the main army of the national movement, that there is no powerful national movement without the peasant army. So that's why we focus on collectivization and decolocization. Between 1931 and 1934, millions of peasants starved to death throughout the Soviet Union. I should say we're political scientists, so much of our approach is shaped by this particular discipline. While famine was endemic in the new Soviet state, a perilous set of policies purposely weaponized hunger as a means of repressing Ukrainian national identity, thereby becoming today what is known as the Holodomor, or death by hunger. While memory of the Holodomor was actively repressed during much of the Soviet period, in the late 1980s, Gorbachev's policy of openness initiated discussion of past events. A few years later, the collapse of the Soviet Union enabled greater archival access to primary documents, including so much of the oral history that has been developed in the years since, that relate back to the famines of the early 1930s. To this day, however, scholarly research on the Holodomor remains underfunded and perhaps undervalued. Of course, this does not apply to the University of Alberta. This paper contributes to the formidable literature on the Holodomor by advancing a novel thesis connecting the actions of the Soviet state back to not only the perceived threat of Ukrainian nationalism in the 1930s, but also to the dominant economic systems of the period. We propose that in order to understand the Holodomor more carefully, scholars need to examine the intersection between ethnicity and mode of production, in Ukraine. Traditional farming practices in Ukraine were distinct from those elsewhere in the Russian Empire. These practices emphasize small-scale family farms and landowning peasants, in contrast to the feudal serfdom and tenant farming that were preeminent in Russia proper. After the revolution of 1917, this economic model rendered Ukrainians more hostile to the collectivization of agriculture pursued by the Soviet government. Thus, not only was the Ukrainian identity decried by Stalin as bourgeois nationalism, a threat to inter-ethnic cohesion, but the very way in which the Ukrainian peasantry had organized their society was fundamentally opposed to the Bolshevik demand for an agricultural system centered around collective and state-owned farms. When examining the Holodomor through this perspective, it can be argued that mass starvation was not merely an offshoot of egregious violence towards a particular ethnic group, but part of a much larger phenomenon. Beginning in 1928, the Soviet state pursued a policy of decolonization, in which small landholders had their property expropriated and were arrested, deported, executed. To understand the history of the Holodomor more fully, we propose that it was not only an act of inter-ethnic violence, but also represented the culmination of decolonization, or interclass violence. Ukrainians were identified by the Soviet government as a unique threat to the state and repressed with genocidal intent. I'm Steve, stay a little bit further away from the camera. This paper seeks to expand upon the economic origins of this mass violence. Among other sources, will address personalized testimonies and construct microhistories in order to substantiate such claims. So what is this notion of an economic theory of the cause of the Holodomor? Traditional farming practices in Ukraine were distinct from those elsewhere in the Russian Empire. These practices emphasize small-scale family farms and landowning peasants, closely approximating the practices of, in quotation marks, kulaks. These practices sharply contrasted with the traditional farming practices of Russia, which are defined by feudal serfdom and tenant farming, which more closely approximated the arrangement of state and collective farms. This economic model rendered ethnic Ukrainians more hostile to the collectivization of agriculture than other constituent nations and nationalities of the USSR. Thus, the very way in which the Ukrainian peasantry organized its society was fundamentally opposed to the Bolshevik demand for an agricultural system centered around collective and state-owned farms. A testimony to these differences between Ukraine and Russia was alluded to by Mykola Zabolotny, who witnessed the famine in Kulukhi village in the Vinnytsia Oblast. And I'll quote from the oral history that he provided. My father worked at the state farm, not the collective farm. So the pressure to which he was subjected was different. For example, they called him a kulak. They didn't let him graze his cow on collective farmland. We had to graze our cow by the road in the ditches. We had to give in 180 liters of milk a year, double what the collective farmers had to give, which was 90 liters. There were many arrests during decolocization. They established a court in our school. I saw the trials. They accused those poor people who they brought from the prison in Lytton of being exploiters. What kind of exploiters were they? They simply had their own farms and hired people to help them during the harvest. The people they hired should have been thankful that they could earn something, but for Soviet power, they were exploiters. They organized a collective farm in my grandfather's house. They arrested him, his wife, his youngest son, Metodi, took them to prison, and they never came back. So that's the end of the quote. The repression of Ukrainians in the early 1930s then was driven in part by an attempt by the Soviet state to eliminate alternate models, economic models, to its decentralized command economy. In this case, repression fell along ethnic lines due to the unique history of Ukrainian agriculture. Thus, we argue that the Holodomor was a reaction by the Soviet state to Ukrainian opposition to collectivization, and as such can be understood as the culmination of decolonization, itself the primary means by which the state attempted to destroy resistance to collectivization in the countryside. So I'll turn it over to Ben at this point.
Sure. I'll get a little closer. All right. Всім доброго дня. Good afternoon to everybody. I'd just like to start off by saying what an honor it is to be here today. Ukraine is a country which is near and dear to my heart. I spent 2 years in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and it's such an honor for me to be here at this conference today and contributing. So thank you so much. I have a small PowerPoint I'd like to share with all of you. Give me 1 second. Okay. Is it visible? Yes? Okay, excellent. Excellent. So, better. So, our argument, as Ray went over, is that traditional farming practices in Ukraine were distinct from elsewhere in the Russian Empire and then later on the Soviet. This economic model that was utilized in Ukraine rendered ethnic Ukrainians particularly hostile to the collectivization of agriculture, which was pursued after 1928. In turn, this led to the collective repression of Ukrainians that we know today as the Holodomor. So this all begs the question, what are the traditional agricultural practices of Ukraine, and why do they render Ukrainians so hostile? So most of what is today Ukraine was controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from 1569 right until the very end of the 18th century. The state was dissolved in 1795. While the dominant system of agriculture in Poland-Lithuania was, of course, serfdom, serfdom in Poland-Lithuania looked quite different from serfdom in Russia. So whereas in Russia, virtually all land was held by the crown gentry, in Poland-Lithuania, 80% of all arable land was held by the small and the middle gentry. Because the landowners were smaller and they had less monarchical backing, less rents were actually due to be extracted from serfs. Moreover, the system was very heterogeneous. So, for example, in the Vistula Basin of Poland in the first half of the 17th century, serfdom was comparatively more ingrained there, and more rents were due to be extracted from the serfs. However, this contrasts with colonial Ukraine during this time. Because it was a colony, it was thus being colonized by new landowners, and this meant that serfs in that area had less rents due to be extracted from them, and there was actually quite a large number of peasants which had no obligations whatsoever. So eventually, of course, Ukraine is incorporated into the Russian Empire. As I said, the bulk of it coming under Russian power by the end of the 18th century. But this directly preceded major changes to the system of serfdom that was employed in Russia during that period. So some of those changes to serfdom, first of all, peasants were no longer delivered into bondage via land grants. So whereas before a landholder would be given a grant, allocating territory to them, and all of the peasants in that area would be due rents to be extracted from them to the landholder, this became no longer the case right after Ukraine was colonized by Russia. In Western border provinces of the Russian Empire in particular, there were major changes to serfdom at this time. For example, in the 1810s, as early as the 1810s in the Baltic states, which had German landowners, Baltic Germans, serfdom was abolished in that period. So serfdom was not abolished in Ukraine until 1861 with the general freeing of serfs, but there were Polish landholders in Ukraine primarily. And the Russian government looked at them with quite a bit of suspicion, particularly following the insurrection of 1831. And they severely prescribed the amount of rents to be extracted. And yes, so what does this all mean? Serfdom was introduced into Ukraine in an attenuated form in which small landholders were more common than in Russia. After colonization, Ukrainians did not experience the same degree of indentured servitude that Russian peasants did. Moreover, Ukrainians were only subject to the Russian feudal system for less than a century, depending on where. Some areas less than 60 years, less than a lifetime. In summation, Ukrainian peasants experienced a weaker form of serfdom for a shorter period than the Russian counterparts. So I have a map here denoting the Russian colonization of Ukraine. I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse or not, but as you can see, Kiev and some surrounding areas colonized in 1772. Bulk of the country over here, 1793. Some places earlier, 1733. Crimea, 1783. Odessa, which of course did not come from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, 1812, so on and so forth. But I think it's quite an illustrative map. Okay, so because we can't read the whole paper, I'll skip forward quite a ways to decolocization. So decolocization, in 1928, Stalin introduced his first 5-year plan. This plan was driving at industrialization of the Soviet Union via forced savings. What forced savings meant is that peasants would be forced to sell their grain at a low price set by the state to the state, which would in turn sell it on international markets for a higher price, using the savings to invest in industrialization. So unsurprisingly, the peasants were unwilling to part with their agricultural goods at this low price set by the state and would rather consume or destroy them, which they of course did. In 1929, Stalin accelerates the plan for collectivization of agriculture as a result of this recalcitrance amongst the peasantry. The primary means by which the Soviet government tries to collectivize the countryside is really dekulakization. It's a genocidal attack on the kulaks. So some of the slogans they're using in the countryside during this period: we will make soap of the kulaks. Our class enemy must be wiped off the face of the earth. So decolonization really was a war of the city versus the countryside, of the proletariat versus the peasant. And like I said, it was genocidal. So kulaks were to be eliminated as a class. Kulak status was hereditary, defined in terms of families. If your father's a kulak, you're a kulak. If your wife's a kulak, you're a kulak, so on and so forth. They were subject to dehumanizing stereotypes, some of which we've already heard, and they were eliminated in large numbers. At least 30,000 of those who were termed kulaks were executed, and 2 million were deported to either the Far East or the Far North or Siberia. A 1932 OGPU estimate found that of that 2,500,000, a full quarter, had either died or run away. So in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian SSR, this war of the countryside and the city takes on a very much ethnic character. The reason for this is because the countryside was almost entirely Ukrainian, whereas cities were more cosmopolitan. So the Soviet census of 1926 found that in Ukraine, only 11% of Ukrainians lived in cities. This contrasts with 20.7% of Poles, 50% of Russians, and 77.4% of Jews. So during decolonization, the so-called national question is increasingly bleeding into the peasant question. Not only are almost all peasants in Ukraine Ukrainian ethnically, they're also far more opposed to collectivization than nearly anywhere else probably anywhere else, I should say, in the USSR. A full 50% of peasant uprisings in the year 1930 came from Ukraine, it being a comparatively smaller state than, say, the Russian Soviet Federation, illustrates how resolutely opposed Ukrainians were to collectivization of agriculture. So it should be noted that this linking of the peasant question with the national question is really nothing new. As Ray read at the beginning, the quote from Stalin, which I'll now repeat, this is coming from a speech he gave in 1925. The peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. That explains the fact that the peasantry constitutes the main army of the national movement, that there is no powerful national movement without the peasant army. So because of the link between small tenant farming and rendering Ukrainians particularly hostile to collectivization, and the overwhelmingly rural population of Ukrainians, the Ukrainian nationality becomes an extremely easy target for the Soviets in their war against the peasantry. So moving on to the Holodomor. In 1932, widespread famine is very much taking hold. The resistance of the peasants who would not accept the reimposition of what they called second serfdom, referring to collectivization. The famine starts getting really, really bad in Ukraine in 1932. In June of that year, Stalin is already developing his national interpretation, well before Ukrainian nationalists are thinking of it in this light. This can be found in several letters he sent. One particularly illustrative one comes from the 11th of August, 1932, a letter Stalin wrote to Kaganovich, in which he says, "We may lose Ukraine." Ukraine is very clearly now the main issue of the Politburo. This crisis spurs Stalin to apply his well-developed model of preventative, category-based repression, which first reached its peak with decolonization. So the decision to use the famine by enormously and artificially strengthening it in order to impart a lesson to peasants who refused this new serfdom was taken in the fall of 1932. Because in Ukraine, the peasant question is the national question, in order to solve these questions, the Politburo felt they needed to get rid of national elites and their policies, which were suspected of abetting peasants. Thus, the Politburo passes two secret decrees on the 14th and 15th of December, officially reversing the nationality policy of Ukraine. This is very important to note because the only constituent republic of the USSR at this time that had their nationality policy reversed was Ukraine, not Russia, not Belarus, not Kazakhstan, all of which had famines raging at that time. The decree orders the correct implementation of Ukrainization in Ukraine. And it's also during this period that Soviets start arresting people accused of being part of a counter-revolutionary Ukrainian military organization. Of course, what happens next is an unmitigated disaster, which we today know as the Holodomor. So to conclude briefly, why did the Holodomor happen? The goal of this paper is really to illuminate some of the economic reasons for why the Holodomor came about. So when looking at through that economic lens, we can say that the Holodomor was a continuation of decolocization. Because of Ukraine's particular history, Ukrainians were more likely to resist collectivization. When the first 5-year plan failed, and it failed quite spectacularly, in Ukraine, the class enemies fell pretty squarely along ethnic lines. From decolonization, the targeted repression of Ukrainians was indeed a logical conclusion. So that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Olga Bertelsen, and her title of her paper is Suppressing and Concealing Peasant Resistance in Ukraine During Stalin's Collectivization. Olga Bertelsen is an associate professor of global security and intelligence at Tiffin University School of Criminal Justice and Social Sciences, educated at the Medical State University in Ukraine, Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania in the United States, Penn State University, and the University of Nottingham in the UK. She's published widely on Soviet-Russian operations of ideological subversion, political violence in the USSR, and the methods and traditions of the Soviet-Russian secret police. She's the author of The House of Writers in Ukraine, the 1930s, Conceived, Lived, Perceived, and the author and the editor of 3 anthologies of archival KGB documents, and 2 collections of scholarly essays titled Revolution and War in Contemporary Ukraine and Russian Active Measures, 2000. This last one is a very recent publication published this year. A new book she has completed called In the Labyrinth of the KGB will be published by Lexington Books in January of 2022. I can now give the floor to Olga, and she also would have up to 25 minutes to present her paper.
Thank you very much, Bogdana, for this introduction. Hello, everyone, and I will probably begin by saying that I missed actually our live conversations, our live conferences, but I'm very pleased to be part of this sort of intellectual exchange thanks to our technology. And I would like to thank the HREC and person Oleksandra who invited me to be a part of this important event. Thank you very much. And I'll be discussing today the progression of violence in Ukraine and the tactics of control, particularly the Soviet politics of silence, control of the Ukrainian peasantry that rebelled against Stalin's collectivization policies at a very early stage. And this resistance sort of set the stage for extreme state violence. More specifically, I will talk about the early stage of collectivization, late 1928, early 1929, a period that we should examine, I think, more closely because the escalation of violence started precisely then. the Soviet authorities used a variety of tactics in Ukraine, and I believe recognizing these tactics may help us understand how difficult it was for people living and being abused and assaulted during the Stalin era to see the alternatives and how these tactics limited their freedom, their well-being, and their safety. Among those tactics are, first of all, emotional abuse, because we all know, and there is a number of wonderful works on this particular topic, how Stalin criticized and degraded the peasantry. It's very well documented. The peasants, in Stalin's view, were backward and unfit to fully accept, understand, and embrace collectivization. The Soviets also used intimidation, coercion, and threats. Violent state tactics included, and this is very important, isolation. Those who were, the isolation of those who were identified as enemies and transgressors. They were isolated geographically and socially in order to to be kept under control. And finally, the Soviet authorities denied and concealed their violence and genocidal practices in Soviet republics, including Ukraine, from Soviet citizens and the international community. And I will discuss the latter tactics in more detail during the second part of my talk, but why should we consider denial, the politics of silence, and cover-up operations important? In my view, they're the building blocks of genocidal practices, because the space within silence is usually devoid of diverse voices and therefore permits little dissent. Without dissent, there is little resistance, thereby guaranteeing maintenance of the existing power structure. In Ukraine, the state controlled information about violent peasant resistance to collectivization, especially from foreign journalists, and I think for a good reason. A common assumption is that whoever controls information has power, but I believe an opposite supposition seems equally true. Whoever commands silence also has power, and the knowledge about the peasant rebellions and the Soviet authorities' ability to silence the dissent and to conceal the progression of their violence in Ukraine, that, as we know, culminated in 1932-33, opens the window into the past to reveal how powerful state violence and the politics of silence was in the Soviet Union. So what happened in Ukraine in the late 20s, and what were the reasons behind this steady progression of state violence? From late 1928, unbearable taxation and grain procurement plans, impoverishment, disfranchisement, starvation, and social uncertainties placed, I think, the majority of the Ukrainian peasantry in opposition to the Soviet regime. But we should keep in mind that the GPU registered anti-Soviet sentiment in all Ukrainian okrugi much earlier. At the beginning of 1926, which inspired the GPU leadership to issue the infamous September 1926 circular letter about Ukrainian separatism. And indeed, in late 1925, early 1926, leaflets that called for the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Peasant Republic, which would unite the Ukrainian peasantry against the Soviet economic policies, had become a widespread phenomenon in the countryside. Peasants discussed the creation of unions to resist Soviet power that had deceived them. And we can still hear their voices because we read archival documents. A lot of them were saying actually that Soviet power is the power of a gang of criminals. We have to do something about it. But this information, of course, was shielded by the politics of silence and special operations that from the inceptions of the USSR to its very end helped the Soviet regime conceal and obscure national, social, cultural, and economic policies and their consequences. We should also remember that the decision made in December 1926 to launch a new collectivization campaign was initially publicly denied by Stalin. And that's where sort of this politics of silence started. It started actually much earlier, but this is just one of those crucial moments. In 1927, at meetings with foreign workers, delegations that arrived in Moscow to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, Stalin refuted the rumor of the state's intention to collectivize the peasantry, and he actually rejected all-embracing collectivization as an ineffective method which contradicted the interests of the peasant. But a few weeks after Stalin's speeches before the foreign workers, the implementation of all-embracing collectivization began. In late 1927, the artificially created imbalance, and Ray talked a little bit about this, between the prices of manufactured goods and agricultural products discouraged peasants from selling bread to the state. State granaries were immediately emptied. The state immediately established the mechanisms of pressure to force the peasants to sell their grain, or giving it to the state on the state's conditions. What were these mechanisms? First of all, during the election campaign of 1928-1929, there were nearly 1 million people in Ukraine who were deprived of voting rights. Who were they? Those who expressed the slightest displeasure with Soviet policies, or who were selling a surplus of grain for cash to simply survive. A system of coercion and exaction in the form of unbearable taxes was installed. The taxes were so high that peasants flooded the district tax offices with petitions asking to reduce their tax because they couldn't pay it. Private households paid twice as much tax as collectivized households. Those that were coerced actually into joining collective farms. And of course, we know all about the religious persecution, starvation, diseases, and increasing scale of terror against peasants that exacerbated their suffering and provoked fierce passive and active resistance to coercion and Soviet collectivization policies. According to the official statistics, on the union level, the authorities registered 63 large-scale anti-governmental rebellions in rural areas. In 1929, there were more than 1,300 reported incidents that involved 244,000 participants. And the lion's share of this information came from Ukraine. Villages rebelled against the regime using various forms of resistance, passive, active, and even armed. Also, the GPU systematically, as we know, confiscated firearms left over from the civil war from the peasantry. And by the way, today we're lucky to have our discussant who wrote extensively, Lynn Viola, who wrote extensively about this. Growing anti-collectivization protests in Ukraine presented an existential threat to the Soviet regime and its survival. To remove the obstacles, Stalin had to do what? To bastardize the behavior of the wealthiest part of the peasantry and to dehumanize the enemies of Soviet power, justifications for a cascade of cleansing operations that followed. Almost a decade after Soviet power was established in Ukraine, the threat of Ukraine's secession seemed to be serious and real to Stalin. According to some scholars' calculations, Stalin could rely only on 5% of Ukrainian society who could be characterized and only conditionally as conscious pro-Soviet group of people. Therefore, the extraordinary measures were essentially the only solution from his perspective, from Stalin's perspective, to the crisis. A solution Stalin kept promoting vigorously. In April 1929, he advised the local party cells to mobilize the poorest Ukrainian peasantry against Korkuli or kulaks. And shortly thereafter, the Ukrainian party leader Stanislav Kostyor reported that 18,000 Kurkul households were auctioned off or confiscated as punishment for hoarding grain. In autumn of 1929, 15,000 more peasant households were destroyed. And we're talking only about the early stage of collectivization. Soviet procurements of foodstuffs to supply non-Ukrainian regions exhausted the Ukrainian peasant households. From mid-1928, they began to literally starve. And by early 1929, the famine affected thousands of people in Ukraine, and the hostility toward Soviet power became pandemic. The exponential growth of anti-Soviet peasant revolts during the second part of 1929 provoked the government to consider more severe punishments, and the death penalty became a sort of a more common sentence. The luckiest, approximately 850,000 Ukrainian peasants were sentenced to 10 years in exile, being transported to the Kola Peninsula in Siberia. According to the official data, over the course of these 2 years, 1927-28, 538 terrorist acts were registered in Ukrainian villages. This in 1928-1929, this number more than doubled. And from 1927 to 1929, 318 representatives of Soviet power in villages were attacked and murdered by the villagers. By late 1929, mass riots involved hundreds of thousands of people. And this is very important to emphasize here, because I'm still working on this particular topic. We don't know the dynamics in these particular places, but this is very important. The GPU lost control over 8 Ukrainian округи: Полтавська, Ізюмська, Харківська, Сумська, Проскурівська, Кам'янецька, Одеська, and the Moldavian Autonomous Republic, which was part of Ukraine between 1924 and 1940. Completely lost control over these 8 regions. The GPU managed to restore Soviet power there only by late 1929, early 1930. Also, mass sort of Babyu Bunty still erupted in Shepetivka, Starobelsk, and Kupiansk. And we're talking about the current Khmelnytska Oblast. Starobelsk is a city near Luhansk, and Kupiansk is part of the Kharkiv Oblast. However, the riots continued to grow in 1929 and reached their peak in 1930. They absorbed 4 large okruги: Kievska, Belocerkivska, Mogilov-Podilska, and Vinnytska. So from March 1st to March 15th of 1930, the GPU arrested 25,000 people, liquidated 36 counter-revolutionary organizations and 256 counter-revolutionary groups, shot 655 individuals, sent approximately 4,000 men to concentration camps, and exiled approximately 6,000 people. In total, the operation resulted in the displacement of approximately 89 peasants, and the next goal was to cleanse Ukraine's near border territories by exiling another 15,000 people. So now, when sort of I just said a few words about this situation in Ukraine during these particular years, I believe these realities provide sort of the foundation for a more careful understanding of the reasons behind advancing the politics of silence in Ukraine, and issuing circular number 984, a document produced by the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, Narkomandel, in Moscow at the dawn of the collectivization campaign. And this document, the circular, helps establish, I think, the connection between peasant rebellions, state violence in Ukraine, its intentionality, and the state's attempt to conceal it altogether from Soviet citizens and foreign observers. Generally, we know that the Soviets tried to conceal this information from the international community. Yet, this particular document that I discovered in the Kharkiv State Archive several years ago, that would actually explicitly outline the course of action that would prevent foreigners from observing a true war and the famine in the Ukrainian countryside in 1928, 1929, was discovered for the first time. And this tangible evidence of concealment was an early practice that the Kremlin used in Ukraine. What does it reveal? First of all, from my perspective, the intentionality of violence and coercion, the extraordinary measures in the form of death penalties and lengthy sentences undertaken by Moscow was supposed to create a dome of silence over the realities in Ukrainian villages. The circular ordered the local authorities to restrict foreigners' movements within Ukraine, in Ukraine, by all possible means, and forbade the Ukrainian party bosses to accommodate foreign visitors and journalists' requests to rent a car or to give press conferences, etc. The Narkomandel in Moscow also warned the local Soviet and party organs in Kharkiv that they would bear full responsibility for any failure to monitor foreigners' movements in Ukraine. Moscow advised the Kharkiv authorities, the party bosses, to limit contacts with those foreign journalists who were not willing to inform them about their plans and intentions while being in Ukraine, and instructed them, Kharkiv in particular, to obstruct visitors' attempts to obtain any information about local developments. In other words, any assistance in organizing their trips to border regions or factories or villages was strictly forbidden. Moscow suggested that largely the Kharkiv GPU should handle the situations with the foreigners. And the party bosses had to assist the GPU somehow in this process. Ultimately, the chief responsibility of the Narkomandel and the GPU was to maintain the myth about the first successful socialist state by preventing truthful journalist accounts about the disaster in Ukraine, about a true war in the Ukrainian countryside. So the politics, I think, of silence strategically demarcated and isolated Ukrainian villages from the proper attention of their fellow citizens in the Union and internationally. Silence was an effective political strategy that made resistance and political mobilization difficult, but made it possible to identify and personalize the transgression. More profoundly, I believe silence and the relatively hermetic information blockade created a space for direct state violence that crushed the subsequent more numerous and large-scale peasant rebellions in 1930, 1931, producing a ghetto of exclusion that culminated in the Holodomor in 1932-33. Cloaked by silence, this opaque space didn't simply exclude and isolate people's sort of experiences and suffering from the rest of society. I think it fundamentally negated their existence. In this landscape, people's experiences became a public secret that muddied the truthful record about their disobedience, their resistance, and the state's violent attempts to suppress them. As in any other genocide, the state politics of silence served and continues to serve as the foundation and a condition for brutality and violence, a mass killing of millions of people by starvation during several months in late 1932, early 1933 in Ukraine in our case. Denial and concealment are, as I mentioned earlier, the building blocks of genocidal practices, which combined with the extremely large number of the dead and murdered who were framed as nationalists and anti-Soviet elements in Ukraine, magnify the intrinsic inhumane nature of the Soviet regime, placing Soviet collectivization policies squarely in the category of genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. We have plenty of time, so we can now turn to the discussant, who is Professor Lynn Viola of the University of Toronto. And briefly, Lynn Viola is university professor at the University of Toronto. She's a specialist in the history of the Soviet Union, focusing on political and social history. Her research interests include gender, rurality, political culture, and violence in the Stalin era. Her books include The Best Sons of the Fatherland, Workers in the Vanguard of Soviet Collectivization, 1987, Peasant Rebels Under Stalin, Collectivization and the Culture of Peasant Resistance, which was referred to and which any student, I think, who wants to learn about collectivization and resistance would have to read. The War Against the Peasantry, 1927-1930, The Unknown Gulag, The Lost World of Stalin's Special Settlements, and her latest Stalinist Perpetrators on Trial, Scenes from the Great Terror in Soviet Ukraine. I'd like to maybe emphasize the point of that title in the sense that Professor Viola has worked with Ukrainian documents and with Ukrainian scholars, and so she knows quite a bit, I think, about the specificities of Ukraine. So we have plenty of time. Up to 15 minutes is fine, even a few minutes longer if you wish. Please.
I don't know if I'll need the entire 15 minutes, but let's see how things go. I want to thank the paper givers. These papers certainly contribute to our further understanding of questions of resistance and repression during the famine in the Ukrainian countryside. Dunbar and Taurus discuss the significance of Ukrainian small farming as an additional reason for the extent of repression and the famine in the Ukraine countryside, along with the already known national issues. Bertelsen explores the politics of silence as a tool as well as a consequence of state crimes. And she looks at the early practices of repression in the countryside, not just the Ukrainian countryside, but the Soviet countryside on the eve of mass collectivization. So a brief commentary certainly will not suffice to thoroughly evaluate the significance of the papers, but let me say a few words. I'll give it a try. So in terms of the first paper, I think Dunbar and Taurus are absolutely correct that Ukrainian small holding farmers had much at stake in resisting the state. I think you're also correct to suggest that the state sought to destroy small land holdings as a particular perceived threat. I would suggest, however, a few considerations. First, while it's true that there were a vast number of peasant disturbances in Ukraine, particularly in 1930, which was the height of active resistance, there were 4,098. There were an equally large number of disturbances that occurred in Russia, perhaps more, in fact. But that's not really the point where there was more. The question is, what sorts of conditions facilitated this? Well, as you say, and I think rightly, in Ukraine, you had small holding. But if you look in Russia at the areas where there were the largest numbers of disturbances, they tended to be in areas that had communal land farming, but not simply communal farming, but areas that had high density in the villages, high density and extreme poverty. And these were areas where there was very little social division. I don't want to use the word class because I think it doesn't fit the countryside, but these were areas with very little social division. So it's not just small landholding areas where there are extremely violent reactions to the state's repressive policy. Now, another thing to take in mind, into account, is Siberia. Siberia also does not have the same heritage of communal land tenure. So in some ways, you might want to compare it to Ukraine, except the whole issue of population density, size of the region is vastly different. But this was an area where small landholding dominated. Yet there were brutally large rebellions. And just as Olga told us about these areas in which, control was completely lost, same sort of things happened in Siberia. So I think it's important to keep in mind that you're right. The method, the mode of landholding is important. But I think you've got to take into account other factors as well. And I would also say, read more broadly on the history of collectivization and particularly resistance and decolocization in the Soviet Union as a whole. And keep in mind, decolocization was not just about kulaks. It was both more tragic and larger than that. It was above all an attack on traditional elites. And in some respects, kulaks might be considered part of this traditional elite. But it also included people from the old regime. So farmers are as policemen, for example. It included economic elites like blacksmiths and other artisans. It included the rural intelligentsia, particularly teachers, found themselves dekulakized. And of course, most of all, and I think, again, Olga made this clear, it included people who resisted. So I think we need to take care about using this word kulak. And it's almost an insult to call these small landholders kulaks, by the way, because they were small farmers, right? And in some ways, if you want to make the argument that they were small farmers, it would be interesting to explore differences between farmers and peasants, as well as the different land tenures. Now, I also think that more context is necessary to explain the whys of collectivization and famine, as well as consideration of contingency. Both are especially important to your discussion of why the Soviet state only reversed nationalities at this time. So nationality policies at this time. So what's going on in the Soviet Union and the world in general? In other words, what I'm suggesting in here is the historian talking to the political scientist. So if you will, think more about causation generally. What does it mean? There are precipitants in causation. There are shorter term causes. There are longer term causes, like ideology might be a longer term cause, or for example, difference in land tenure. But think about causation in a more complex way, because I think it will only strengthen your argument. Again, while I agree that the state did seek to suppress small landholders, there were a host of other reasons as well. And what I have argued previously is that really what the Soviet state was doing was seeking hegemony over the village, not only over the village economy, whether it be communal land tenure or small land holding, but also over those areas of relative village autonomy, like self-government, traditional elites who are caught up in collectivization, and of course the church, which has an influence in this village, in the village setting. Finally, I'd love to see you extend your source base, especially to the huge amount of documents that have been published or are online, and they treat these issues in I think, a very nuanced way. Next, Olga Bertelsen. I like the stress that Olga places on the politics of silence. And I'd like to see more on this throughout the Soviet period. I don't know if this is the next book you're working on, but I kind of hope so. And I think some of these issues can be extended beyond Ukraine, although you make, a very sophisticated argument for Ukraine itself. But I want to remind you about the multi-volume archival document collection Tragedia Sovietskaya Dredny. If you look at the very first document published, it's from 16 April 1927. And it's a Glavly circular on censorship of any mention of food supply. And so, this is a part of Soviet policies, particularly from the second half of the 20s. But I think I see it as something much more broad. This silence is something that is meant for the whole country. And Viktor Petrovich Danilov, who was the main editor on this collection, began the collection with this document because he always saw the suppression and censorship of knowledge is fundamental to the Soviet project. So that's some super backing for you. I would like to see more discussion of the politics of silence in terms of cause versus consequence. And here again, as in the other papers, context is one of the historian's more important tools. What else is going on? We can't forget the war paranoia of this regime. We cannot forget how terrified the regime was now and later of other governments knowing its weaknesses. And at the same time, we have to remember that the revolt of the peasantry shook the state strongly and added to the causes for silence. And of course, they weren't successful in maintaining silence. Peasants, although Solzhenitsyn said peasants were a silent people, they weren't. And so people were writing. This is another kind of protest. In the case of German peasants, they were writing to the German consul and the German government. So that in February 1930, the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs was already urging that foreign citizens, they were Soviet citizens, foreign citizens be treated more carefully. And of course, people are also crossing the border, fleeing, particularly in the East, but also in the West. I think silence is a subset of secrecy. I think secrecy is really kind of the key word. And here, the Soviet government suffered from an extreme illness of secrecy. And so it's not just these decrees mandating quiet or mandating that foreign journalists can't have anything to say. But these are the decrees that try to keep people in place, keep them from moving around and sharing knowledge. Also, any institution that you look in has a secretny отдел, which archivally are the most interesting parts to read. But what they show you, if you read, for example, Narkomziem's secretny отдел, is that a lot of what was secret really had no reason being secret. It's carried to a pathological degree. Other parts of secrecy, which I hope you'll look at, euphemisms. The euphemisms that pepper the documents, what do they mean? Is this an attempt to hide things? Why do they call special settlements special settlements? I mean, this is a terrible euphemism, right? But as I said, the documents are peppered with them and they're very interesting. If you look at Teplakov's book, I forget the title, but he has a little glossary of some of the euphemisms of the terror, and it's fascinating and terrible. And of course, and I'll just say this finally, everybody had to sign contracts of silence, right? I don't know if you've seen any of these. I only have heard of them, so secondhand, but it wasn't simply people who had been in the gulag and who had to sign upon their arrest. It's people who served in the NKVD, OGPU, and so on and so forth. So I think silence is such an interesting topic. I really look forward to seeing what you're going to do with this. And I'm sure you're way further ahead than we even know. But I'll leave it at that because I'm sure people want to come into the discussion, or the panelists perhaps to answer, to respond to my comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Viola. And we have, again, plenty of time for the discussion period. And I have one message here at this point, and anyone that would like to pose a question, please use the chat facilities that are available with this Zoom program. Before going to the question itself, I'd like to just make a couple of quick comments myself before we start. And the first is to the first paper, when the title has mode of production, and of course that's sort of a Marxist term that's quite commonly used, but in the collectivization process, there's a certainly, and Professor Viola mentioned that this was an attempt to establish a more complete control over the village. But it's also an attempt by the state, by the party to, I think, control more completely, almost, well, as totally as possible over the mode of production. So the collectivization process is a process by which the state becomes, I think, not a direct owner, but certainly, if we look at Marxist terms, certainly a more complete manager over the economic life of the village. In the context of collectivization, what occurred was, a complete, or almost, well, not a complete, but not only an overturning of all of these relations, but which caused much resistance that was mentioned, but also a collapse almost of the agricultural production process, and this is reflected in the statistics which you see. But the state continued to try to extract as much as possible, even though there was chaos in the countryside, and even though there was this collapse in production. And in 1932, at the Third Party Conference, Kaganovich, who was sent to Stalin to attend the conference, he and Molotov were there, and they wrote a letter to Stalin where they mentioned that all of the Ukrainian Politburo members at a meeting of the Politburo asked that the grain production plan be reduced because they knew that it was, too much for the country to handle. But Kaganovich writes back that we refused. So this all has to be taken into, if we look at the broader context, then we can see that that certainly the authorities, leading authorities in Ukraine, were trying to get some sort of relief, and they were refused to do so by the central authorities. And then this sort of pressure continued on, and various laws were passed and various measures were taken to continue the pressure, and in the context of, the collapse in agricultural production. So this is really, I think, the factor that really intensifies the famine, and the fact that the government is trying to establish control over the process means that they're more and more responsible for it, for what happens. In the matter of silence, this all takes place in the broader context of the regime, which has already established a monopoly of political power, has eliminated all sorts of political opposition, the political parties. It has complete control over the media, controls the media. It has, even within the party, it is starting to stifle whatever sort of meaningful discussions take place within the party. So it's part of the process. The politics of silence, I think, are part of this overall process of, I guess the strangulation of whatever's left of a civil society, and it's an intensification of that, and it's an indicator of how powerful the state is in the Soviet Union. And I'll leave my comments at that point. So we can go to the first question here. To the presenters of the first paper, do you not think that there were regional differences and types of landholding in Ukraine, the right bank, the left bank, and the south, which had different traditions? I also suggest you refine your beginning to take into account the Khmelnytsky revolt and the Cossack Hetmanate. I believe your map is in need of correction. And this is a comment by Dr. Frank Sisson.
Yes, thank you for the question, Dr. Sisson. Yes, almost certainly there were regional differences. I think this paper for Ray and for me is the start of a larger project which we're interested in, which would actually be going in and coding different areas of Ukraine to use for quantitative analysis. So what that would involve is actually looking at the particular histories of different areas, looking at the statistics we can come up with for maybe like average tenant size indicators of these sort of type, and then going in and using quantitative regression to actually analyze whether these factors have any sort of demonstrable impact upon resistance to collectivization. I think that would be, of course, as Ray said at the beginning, we're political scientists, so that's probably the way we would think about it. That for me seems to be an excellent way to parse out whether or not this agricultural heritage of Ukraine actually has any significance upon later resistance to collectivization or not. Actually comparing subnational entities within Ukraine yes, it's quite possible that map needs some correcting, though I think it is illustrative in demonstrating the growth of the Russian Empire into the territory that is now Ukraine today. And there was a third part of the question, was there not? Here, I'm pulling it up. With respect to resistance activities, okay. Yes, I think it would be very interesting to take into account the Khmelnytsky revolt and the Cossack Hetmanate, especially considering the Cossack Hetmanate, again, is another alternative mode of production, if you will, that is distinct from small land tenure, a la what we're talking about. So the answer to your question is, yes, I think there are regional differences. I think that would actually be the best way to examine the question from a political scientist standpoint, which I hope to do in the future. So.
Okay, I have another question here from Colin Neufeld. The question is, with respect to resistance activities at this time, is it possible to distinguish between the frequency and intensity of resistance activities in Ukrainian communities versus those which occurred in communities largely populated by ethnic minorities, Poles, Germans, Jews, etc. And I'd just like to, before we ask the panelists to answer that question, is there will be a session tomorrow, I believe, on minorities, where that will be discussed to some extent, and Colin will be part of that panel. So I just wanted to bring that up as a point. But to the panelists.
I can start if you don't mind, Bogdan.
Sure.
I just would like to invite all of you, perhaps not many of you know that an interesting collection of essays was published, I think, a couple of years ago, and I'm just looking at my books that I cannot find to show you this collection. So Robert Kuznets initiated this project. He edited a collection of scholarly essays about the Holodomor and the Poles. So I contributed to this collection, and my topic was the Poles in the Kharkiv Oblast. In terms of, sort of a comparative analysis, it's very difficult to say, or to assess actually the level of resistance, simply because those Polish communities, especially in the East, the topics that I explored, they were just much smaller, and we cannot talk about huge numbers of Poles living in this part of Ukraine. However, I invite you to read this collection, and you will get a better idea about what was happening with this particular ethnic group during the Holodomor in 1932-33. And by the way, among those Poles that I'm writing about, there were people who engaged in those practices. They were forced to do that. Cannibalism. It's not only, it's not a Ukrainian phenomenon. It's just, from my perspective, in those places where, we observe mass starvation, cannibalism was an inseparable part of the dynamics. So, and this is sort of something that we have to keep in mind. People are people, no matter who, what kind of background, ethnic background they have, they are engaged or involved in similar behaviors to survive, behaviors of survival. So I know that Dasha Mattingly was working on the Jews' experiences in Ukraine during the Holodomor. I don't know how far she just advanced in terms of her research. However, we shouldn't deny that this particular topic is under-investigated, and we have to go to archives. Unfortunately, COVID slowed us down a little bit, but we have to sort of renew these attempts. We have to go there. We don't know what the future will bring if we can go to Ukraine. This is just the scariest part about this, that we don't know what the Ukraine's future is gonna be under the circumstances, but we have to renew this sort of activity, archival activity, and to understand what other ethnic groups did during this particular time. Did they survive? Did they sort of escape? Did they manage to sort of preserve their human dignity? So this is just a lot of questions about this particular sort of in terms of your, in the context of your question. But Germans, it's another matter. And I don't remember from the top of my head if we do have some, right? I remember one.
Could I intervene, Olga?
Yes.
Because the questioner, if this is the Colin Neufeld I know, probably knows more about this topic than anybody in the world. And so I think he could tell us a great deal. I did want to say that we should remember that Poles were being decolonized as Poles, where along the border areas, another important context, the border areas were very savage because these were areas that the Soviets feared. They feared that people could go back and forth over them. If I can also add, and I'm sorry to interrupt, back to Ray, when you talked about doing a geographic sort of analysis, I think that would be great. But you know, the irony of trying to understand how and why Ukraine is distinct is that you could only do it if you compare it with other parts of the Soviet Union, including Russia. So I would urge you to try and extend this analysis. I don't know if it'll be possible given current politics, but you know, I think Russian and Ukrainian scholars in the West need to talk to each other because we can sort of do this comparison in interesting ways.
Okay. Thank you. I have two questions from Roman Serbin, and it's to all the presenters and the discussant as well. How do you distinguish between the Holdemor in the sense of genocide and the Holdemor in the sense of famine? And I think in the first sense, Holodomor in the sense of genocide would be, as Raphael Lemkin would have understood it, as something beyond just starvation, but the other repressions that were taking place and the other deaths that were occurring, not directly related to the famine, but the political deaths, more or less, right? And the other question is, what was Stalin and his regime's motives in imposing the genocide on the Ukrainian citizens of the USSR, including the Ukrainian SSR, which is, I guess the USSR would be the whole country and the others would be just the republic itself. There were, I guess, there was the anti-Ukrainian decree of December 15th that stopped Ukrainization in the Russian Federation. And there were ethnic Ukrainians who lived outside of the borders of the Ukrainian SSR. So I guess that would pertain to that. That would sort of fall into that question. Would anyone among the panelists like to address that, those two questions?
I think that the literature has established the famines, by and large, were a result of the first 5-year plan. I think it's hard to say whether they were intentional or not, though it seems as if it was not necessarily intended to have this massive famine, but when it happened, it was utilized by a regime in order to repress the peasantry, in particular in Ukraine. What makes the Holodomor in Ukraine different from elsewhere is exactly as Bogdan was just saying, this reversal of the nationality policy. Of course, many people starved to death in Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, of course. But the nationality policy, Colonization, that was not reversed in any of those states. Also, from my understanding, in Russia and Belarus, the borders were not sealed, either between the constituent republic nor between the city and the countryside. That meant that peasants were able to seek help, were able to go to the cities, were able to try to beg for bread, whereas that was not the case in Ukraine. There was active barricades between the country and the city. So Holodomor is definitely part of a wider famine, which was caused by the first 5-year plan. What makes it uniquely genocidal is, I think, exactly as Bogdan was getting at, the nationality policy in combination with the closing of borders, and both internally and the republic's borders.
I can also add a couple of points. First, I think Holodomor means different things for different people. For me, Holodomor is not only about the famine, and of course it depends on what books people read. By the way, not very much has been published on the assault, an attack against the intelligentsia in Ukraine. So we have to consider this particular sort of very important element of genocidal practices. And this is just part of the Holodomor from my perspective, because those people who were intellectuals in Ukraine supporting and simply talking about the Holodomor, they were all gone. They were repressed. They were killed. We don't have to guess what was the motivation there. Stalin and the political leadership, they were afraid of this sort of crystallization, the process of crystallization of Ukrainian identity. And that's why, because of the elimination of the entire strata of this particular, of Ukrainian society back then, as a result of it, we had what? A tremendous cultural disruption that Ukraine cannot even recover from even until today. So, of course, all these elements, the national element is very important, the ethnic element of the genocide is very important. And that's why we need more books, we need more scholarship on this particular topic, so that people, those who are not specialists in Holodomor studies, historians, political scientists, so that they realize that Holodomor is a much broader sort of term that doesn't include only the famine. It includes just a number of tactics, including isolationism. Isolationist tactics. How did Ukraine lose all these millions of people? Because it was isolated, by GPU troops, actually. And that's how people couldn't move in or out of these just sort of villages where they were trapped, starving to death. So this is just one of my points.
Okay. Any other comments by either the panelists or no? Okay. We do have 2 more questions here in the chat. I'd like to go to the next question here. My question is addressed to the presenters and the discussant, but maybe someone else can answer or comment on it. Did the USSR recognize dual citizenship, for example, for Soviet Germans, Poles, and or Romanians? And did this status help the victims of collectivization and famine? And that question is from Edward Baidaus to everyone. Would anyone, perhaps our discussant? Yes.
I just wanted to say that these were not dual citizens. These were people who were born in the Soviet Union. So, if you think about the Germans, they had been in Ukraine and Russia from the time of Catherine the Great. So, don't get sucked in by Stalin's use of foreigner for these people. These were genuine Soviet citizens. Now, in terms of other people who got caught up in the repression and who may have had citizenship from elsewhere, I may be wrong, but I believe if they took up Soviet citizenship, they had to give up their old citizenship. Olga, you may have a sense of that.
To my knowledge, I don't think that from sort of legal perspective, by the way, citizens, those people who were ethnically, Poles or Germans, they could have dual citizens in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure about this, but I remember those documents, archival documents that I read, and there were sort of a lot of opinions that were uttered during all these party meetings at the highest level, and they were very, very specific, all those leaders that local or at a high level in Moscow who said we cannot just have this phenomenon. In the Soviet Union, we have to have devoted, dedicated citizens. So I was not involved in a very sort of detailed research on this particular matter, but I remember distinctly that there was opinions that were sort of formulated that we cannot allow this to be happening in the Soviet Union.
Okay. We have about another 15 minutes, I think. There's one more question here to direct it this time to Olga Bertelsen. A strategic overt policy of secrecy and accompanying censorship of dramatically impacted photo documentation, for which there are numerous examples. Could you please repeat the specific decree in Kharkiv you referenced regarding censorship and related restrictions? And perhaps I could maybe add there, we do have very few photographs from the famine period, which I think can also be attributed in part to this politics of silence. Perhaps Dr. Bertelsen or someone else might want to comment on that as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I mentioned the circular, the document that has a number 984. And this document, and I do have a photocopy of this document. Actually, it should be published because it hasn't been published. The original of this document actually should have been returned back to Moscow, where it came from, to the Narkomendel. However, apparently, it escaped somebody's attention, and this document I found this document in a place, in a file that was actually, from my perspective, it didn't belong there. It was just an accident. So someone didn't do their job and didn't send this copy back. But I have a photocopy, and I think at some point it should be published as an image, because then it will offer some kind of a more detailed sort of idea, perspective, what they were after. But interestingly enough, to my knowledge, this document was published, only issued, and there were only several copies, 7 or 8, I don't remember. And obviously, this document was sent to the Kharkiv authorities because a lot of people wanted to go to the Kharkiv Oblast, to Kharkiv itself, to the city, to see, especially foreign journalists, to see what is happening in this particular part of Ukraine, because all this terrible news came from several oblasts, right? And as we know, from Kharkiv and Kiev Oblast and several others. But other documents, other copies were sent also to, of course, to the leadership of the GPU in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, in Kiev, and I believe there were copies somewhere that I don't know where they are. Probably all leadership in Moscow received the rest of the copies, but that was just the document that was not supposed to be discovered actually in Kharkiv. I don't know how it happened that it was still there. But I don't know if I answered your question.
That was to Lana Babi, and Lana Babi was involved in a project to find as many photographs from the 1932-33 famine period, and she did locate some, or was able to identify some that were not either well known or not known at all. But this is a question, this is a part of, I think, of this, the fact that there are so few photographs is, I think, illustrative of how successful the Soviet authorities were in suppressing not only information about the famine, but more broadly are able to control information about what is going on in the country. I know just from reading, speaking about a photographic material, an American writer, Carveth Wells, with his wife, were in the Soviet Union in 1932 and traveled through Ukraine. And he sort of wrote about his travels worldwide. And he, in a presentation he gave, I think in Chicago in early 1933, he mentioned, and I'm recalling from memory, so I may be mistaken, but I think this is the case, that he took some film footage that was confiscated from him. And the film that was confiscated was the film from Ukraine. Although he was able to keep the film that he had of his photos, or it could even be, movie film, right? He may have even had a movie camera. I can't remember, but he had film from, and he filmed his whole trip. And so his trip ended in the Caucasus. So he was able to keep film from parts where there wasn't no famine. So this was, I think, also indicative of how of this, careful control of information on the part of Soviet authorities. Let's see if there's anything. Let's see if there's any more questions here. We have maybe time for one more question here. We have a follow-up question from Roman Serbin. Wouldn't scholars be expected not to confuse in their usage the term Holodomor in both senses? Think of the Holocaust used as genocide and as the incinerating the gazed Jewish victims. So I guess it's a question of definition here. How do we define the Holodomor? Is it defined just as famine and deaths from famine, or is it defined more broadly to include other repressions and other events and decisions that are made by the Soviet authorities that suppress or that destroy physically human beings in other ways than famine? And Olga, you gave your opinion on that already.
I just wanted to add one thing. We shouldn't forget that all those processes that Lemkin mentioned, when he described what genocide is all about, they ran parallel. If someone initiates this project, it would be wonderful. For instance, to compare from a chronological point of view, what was happening simultaneously. I mean, first of all, looking even at the documents from the former KGB archives, secret operations against the intelligentsia, covert operations in the Ukrainian countryside, and to attempt to isolate it and to contain all this, rebellion somehow. And also an assault against, attack against the religious leaders in Ukraine. And if chronologically we sort of compare and look at all this sort of aspects of this genocidal practices in Ukraine, it will fall into place. I mean, for anybody, it's clear that it was just a concerted attack against, the sort of people who resisted in Ukraine. And I don't want to emphasize specifically the role of the Ukrainians in this particular, because in Ukraine was a multicultural, multi-ethnic sort of community of people. I mean, that's who lived there. And a lot of people who were Jews or who were Poles who disagreed with or Germans who disagreed with the regime, they fell victim, no matter who they were. The farmers, for instance, or part of the intelligentsia. So we have to look at this particular sort of developments from a broader perspective, I believe. And again, I want to emphasize this. To me, Holodomor confuses a lot of people because people are trying to offer a direct translation from Ukrainian, translate this term from Ukrainian into English. And what is the result actually of this particular exercise? Holodomor is just, actually death by hunger, right? So, but it's just not the only sort of actions on the part of the state that happened there during this particular time.
If I can just follow up for 1 minute. We have about another 5 minutes yet, if we want to take it. I think going back to even Conquest's book and the criticisms of Conquest that were made by the economist Alec Nove, and he said, "Were Ukrainians were the people who were starved in Ukraine, were they starved as Ukrainians or were they starved as peasants?" And he posed that question, I think, in that sort of way. And I think if we reduce the identity of the peasant in Ukraine and take out the Ukrainians, then one can just see starvation of peasants by a social group. But if we add the modifier Ukrainian, then it becomes something. Then we're talking about something or someone a little bit different. And we don't have a survey, or we don't have a political parties in Ukraine that would reflect the opinions of Ukrainians in the 1920s or in the Holdemor period. So we don't know, but we do know that there were national manifestations of even peasants in the 1920s and early 1930s. I believe in a book that Dr. Viola edited, there's an example of a document of a 1930 a riot or uprising where national slogans are prominent among the peasantry. Well, this also occurs in other periods in the late 1920s and 30s. And there are national reactions to economic policies, as we know, are quite common. So I don't think it's an easy enough to just say, well, these are just peasants being repressed because the national factor, the national question is always there, even if it's hidden under the surface and we don't see it. So that's my I guess, comment to the question of genocide, and that the national question is always there, and if not in the foreground, then it's there in the background, and on occasion it comes out in the correspondence between Stalin and Kaganovich. Specifically, we see it. Is there any other? We have. I guess we're just about at time's limit, but we can go another 3 or 4 minutes if anyone wishes to add anything. If
I
not,
would like to take a minute and thank our discussant, Lynn Viola, for first of all, for carefully reading our text and for very valuable suggestions. And I agree, Lynn, I mean, Stalin and the political leadership relished secrecy. So, I mean, we have to think broader, absolutely. And I do think broader when I, write about the politics of silence, especially in my new book, because this topic probably will never die. And it travels to my sort of new projects. And thank you. I appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much, and thoughtful suggestions.
I'd like to thank everybody on the panel, the presenters as well as the discussant. And I'd like to announce before we go, just formally, that panel 2 of this conference is taking place at 1500 hours, or that would be 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the name of the panel is Narrating the Trauma of the Holdemor. And once again, thank you for everyone. Thank you for all those who gave questions, and good luck in completing your presentations and turning them into papers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.